The silence between applause. Hollywood, 1959. The lights were blinding that night, too bright, even for someone who had spent decades under them. Cameras flashed like summer lightning, applause rolled in waves, and the room smelled faintly of perfume, cigars, and polished wood. It was another glamorous evening, another ceremony where legends smiled as if nothing had ever weighed on them. But behind the composed face of Katharine Hepburn, something shifted. She sat perfectly still, hands folded in her lap, chin lifted with the same unmistakable confidence the world adored. To everyone watching, she was exactly what she had always been, unshakable, sharp, untouchable. Yet when the announcer casually mentioned a familiar name, Dean Martin, her breath caught. Just for half a second. No one noticed, no one ever did. That was her gift. For more than 40 years, she had mastered the art of silence. A reputation built on strength. By the time Katharine Hepburn reached the peak of her career, she was no longer just an actress. She was a symbol. Studios feared her intelligence. Journalists respected her distance. Audiences admired her refusal to conform. She had survived box office failures, public criticism, and an industry that didn't know what to do with a woman who wouldn't bend. She wore trousers when women were expected to wear gowns. She spoke her mind when others stayed quiet. She chose solitude over spectacle. The world believed it knew her. It didn't. Because strength, when practiced long enough, becomes a disguise. And beneath hers lived a story she had never allowed herself to tell. Not to interviewers, not to friends, not even to herself in quiet moments without distraction. A story that began not with romance, but with kindness at exactly the wrong moment. The man no one took seriously. In the late 1940s, Hollywood had already decided who Dean Martin was supposed to be. To producers, he was a singer with charm but no depth. To critics, a crooner hiding behind an easy smile. To gossip columnists, half of a loud, unpredictable duo who didn't fit the refined image of prestige cinema. He was popular but not respected. Dean knew it, he always had. That was the part no one understood about him. Behind the humor, behind the effortless confidence, lived a man deeply aware of how little he was truly taken seriously. And that awareness made him careful, especially around someone like Katharine Hepburn. A meeting that wasn't supposed to matter. They met without ceremony. No dramatic introduction, no grand moment. Just a studio hallway, quiet, unremarkable, and forgotten by everyone except the two people standing in it. Katharine had just finished a grueling rehearsal. She was tired, irritated, and already rehearsing polite refusals in her mind for the small talk she expected to endure. Dean passed by, nodded once, and kept walking. That was it. No flirtation. No lingering glance. No attempt to impress. And for reasons she couldn't explain, that moment stayed with her. Most men tried too hard around her, either intimidated or overly eager. Dean did neither. He treated her like a person who didn't need approval, praise, or conquest. It was unsettling. A quiet kindness. Weeks later, something happened that would never be recorded in any biography. Katharine had received news, private, painful, and destabilizing. The kind of news that doesn't scream but settles heavily in the chest, making even breathing feel like effort. She excused herself from the set early, claiming exhaustion. She wasn't lying. She sat alone in an empty soundstage, lights dimmed, the echo of footsteps long gone. For the first time in years, her composure cracked, not visibly but internally where no one could help her. She didn't hear Dean approach. He didn't announce himself. He simply placed a cup of coffee on the edge of the stage and said softly, "You don't have to talk." Then he turned and walked away. No questions, no curiosity, no attempt to fix anything. Just space. That was the moment the secret was born. Why she never spoke. Katharine Hepburn had built her life on self-reliance. She did not need rescuing. She did not want sympathy. She did not owe vulnerability to anyone. And yet in that small human gesture, something shifted, something dangerous. Because when you've trained yourself never to lean, the smallest support feels like gravity. She never thanked him. He never asked her to. and they never spoke of it again. But from that day forward, every time she heard his voice on the radio, every time she saw him laugh effortlessly in front of cameras, every time his name surfaced in rooms full of applause, she remembered the man who understood silence better than anyone else in Hollywood. The secret she carried. The world would go on believing that Katharine Hepburn was immune to attachment, untouched by emotional reliance, too strong to be affected by anyone who didn't challenge her intellectually. That was exactly how she wanted it. Because the truth, that one quiet act of kindness had stayed with her for decades, that it had shaped how she judged character, loyalty, and dignity, was something she refused to let become gossip, rumor, or spectacle. Some things are powerful precisely because they remain unseen. And so she kept the secret. For 40 years, when silence becomes a risk. Silence is easy when nothing threatens it. But silence becomes dangerous the moment someone notices it. By the early 1960s, Hollywood had changed, but not enough. The studios still watched closely, journalists still hunted for cracks, and fame still demanded a price, especially from those who appeared too controlled, too private, too different. Katharine Hepburn felt it first. Not as fear, as awareness. A tightening in the room when certain conversations paused. A glance held a moment too long. A question asked casually, but repeated twice. And more often than not, the unspoken name hanging in the air was Dean Martin. Two lives moving in parallel. They were never seen together publicly. That was intentional. Katharine kept her distance with surgical precision. No shared photographs, no overlapping interviews, no casual mentions. She knew how rumors were born not from facts but from patterns. Dean understood without explanation. He had spent his life reading rooms, reading people, reading danger. The man everyone thought careless was, in truth, deeply observant. When they crossed paths at industry events, they behaved like strangers who shared nothing but professional courtesy. But sometimes, very rarely, their eyes met. And in that instant, entire conversations passed without words. The night everything almost changed. It happened at a private gathering, a small, invitation-only dinner hosted by people who knew how to pretend discretion while collecting secrets. Katharine hadn't planned to attend. She changed her mind at the last minute. Dean was already there. The room was warm, candlelit, heavy with laughter that sounded slightly forced. Everyone was watching everyone else. Hollywood always did. They sat at opposite ends of the table. It should have been safe. But something was off. Katharine felt it before she saw it, a subtle shift in attention, a pause after Dean spoke, a look exchanged between two guests who leaned closer than necessary. And then it came. A remark light, joking, sharpened with curiosity. "You two seem oddly comfortable ignoring each other." Laughter followed. Katharine smiled. Dean laughed. And for one terrifying second, she wondered if the silence they had protected for years was about to crack. A choice made in a breath. Katharine had always believed strength meant standing firm. That night, strength meant something else. She stood, graceful, calm, unbothered. She redirected the conversation with effortless authority, steering attention away like a seasoned conductor. Politics, theater, anything but emotion. It worked. The moment passed, but something had shifted. Because once a question is asked, even in jest, it cannot be unasked. The cost of protection. Later that night, as guests filtered out, Dean waited until the room was nearly empty before speaking to her. Not about the comment. Not about the tension. He said only one thing. "I won't be the reason you lose control of your life." That was it. No drama. No reassurance. No promises. But Katharine heard what he didn't say. She realized then that protecting the secret no longer meant distance alone. It meant sacrifice. And sacrifices, once begun, rarely stop at one. The decision that followed. Within weeks, Katharine made choices no one understood. She declined projects that would have placed her in the same social circles as Dean. She adjusted schedules, She disappeared from events she once dominated. The press speculated. She's withdrawing. She's difficult again. She's losing relevance. She let them believe it. Because the truth, that she was actively shrinking her world to protect something invisible, was too dangerous to explain. Dean noticed, and it hurt more than he let on. A man who knew when to step back. Dean Martin had never been sentimental in public. He joked, sang, smiled. But privately he understood loss, especially the quiet kind. He began taking roles that kept him away, touring more, staying busy enough to drown thought. Not because he was told to, because he chose to. That choice, the one he made without being asked, became the second half of The Secret. A secret built not on romance, but on restraint. Why The Secret grew heavier. Time didn't erase what had passed between them. It sharpened it. Every year that went by, every award, every headline, every applause-filled room reminded Katharine of the cost she had paid willingly. And the more she succeeded, the more dangerous the truth became. Because the world forgives scandal. What it doesn't forgive is complexity. A story where no one is wrong. A bond without labels. A kindness that never demanded recognition. Those stories don't sell. So she kept silent. And Dean did too. The moment she realized The Secret would never die. Years later, during an interview meant to celebrate her legacy, a young reporter asked an innocent question. Who taught you the most about strength? Katharine paused. Just for a second. And in that pause lived 40 years of restraint, sacrifice, and an unspoken debt she would never publicly repay. She smiled and gave a polished answer. But inside, she understood something clearly for the first time. This was no longer just a secret. It was a burden she would carry to the end. The secret that refused to stay quiet. Time doesn't weaken secrets. It sharpens them. By the late 1960s, Katharine Hepburn had become something almost mythic. She wasn't just admired, she was protected by reputation. Studios tread carefully around her. Interviewers chose their words with caution. She had outlasted trends, scandals, and people who tried to define her. But even legends have blind spots. And hers was the belief that silence, if maintained long enough, becomes invisible. She was wrong. When the past starts asking questions, it began subtly. A producer mentioning Dean Martin's name a little too often. A journalist referencing an unexpected influence in her career. A biographer requesting access to old correspondence she had never shared with anyone. None of it was overt. That was what made it dangerous. Hollywood didn't expose secrets directly. It circled them, starved them of air, waited for them to surface on their own. Katharine felt the pressure building, not publicly, but internally. Every request felt like a hand reaching into a locked drawer she'd kept sealed for decades. And somewhere else, Dean Martin felt it too. Dean's silence was not ignorance. Dean had changed. The world still saw the same easy grin, the same effortless charm, the same laughter that made everything feel lighter than it was. But those closest to him knew better. He had become careful in ways that didn't match his public image. He avoided certain conversations, declined interviews that probed too deeply, redirected questions with humor sharpened by intention. People assumed it was instinct. It was loyalty. Because Dean understood something most people didn't. A secret kept for decades becomes fragile not because it's old, but because it's valuable. The letter she never sent. One night, Katharine sat alone in her study, papers spread across her desk. Awards lined the shelves behind her, but she wasn't looking at them. She was holding a blank sheet of paper. For the first time, she considered writing to Dean. Not to confess, not to explain, but to acknowledge. She wrote his name at the top, then stopped. Because what would she say? Thank you for disappearing. Thank you for protecting me by erasing yourself from my life. Thank you for understanding something I never had the courage to articulate. She folded the paper, tore it in half, and placed the pieces in the fireplace without lighting the flame. Some words, she realized, were too powerful to exist at all. The interview that almost ended everything. The moment of greatest danger came unexpectedly. A televised interview, a retrospective, harmless on the surface. The host was respectful, intelligent, and well-prepared. That alone made Katharine uneasy. They spoke of theater, of independence, of legacy. Then the host asked, carefully, almost kindly, "You've always spoken about strength as restraint rather than dominance. Was there ever someone who taught you that?" The room seemed to contract. Katharine felt it immediately, the sense that the question wasn't random. It was informed. She hesitated. Just long enough. The silence was barely noticeable to the audience, but to her it thundered. For one dangerous heartbeat, she considered telling the truth, not the full story, but a version of it. Something gentle, something safe. She didn't. Instead, she redirected with elegance, praising discipline, self-awareness, and time. The interview moved on. But Katharine knew the line had been crossed. Someone was close. Dean makes a final decision. Word traveled quietly, the way it always did. Dean heard about the interview within days. He didn't panic. He didn't call. He didn't confront her. Instead, he did something far more decisive. He granted an interview of his own. Lighthearted, controlled, perfectly unremarkable. He spoke openly about his career, his influences, his gratitude for the people who had helped him along the way. And deliberately, almost surgically, he framed his life as emotionally simple, professionally driven, uncomplicated by deep personal entanglements. It wasn't true, but it was convincing. And it worked. The speculation evaporated. Just like that. The weight of an unspoken debt. Katharine watched that interview alone. She recognized what he had done instantly. He had closed the door for good. Not just on rumor, on possibility. And for the first time in decades, the weight of the secret felt unbearable. Not because it might be revealed, but because it never would be. She realized then that the silence between them was no longer mutual. It was a gift she could never return. A legacy built on what was never said. As years passed, the danger faded. New stories replaced old ones. New scandals distracted the curious. New generations forgot to ask the right questions. Katharine Hepburn became history while still alive. Dean Martin became legend. And the truth, quiet, human, unremarkable to anyone else, remained locked between them. Not a love story, not a tragedy, but something rarer. A moment where kindness demanded nothing, where restraint became devotion, where silence was chosen, not out of fear but respect. The realization that changed everything. Near the end of her life, Katharine was asked to reflect on her greatest achievement. She smiled. People expected awards, roles, independence. But inside, she knew the truth. Her greatest achievement was not something she had done. It was something she had protected. What survives after silence? Time eventually takes everything. Careers, applause, faces once known by millions. But silence, true silence, outlives them all. Katharine Hepburn understood this near the end, when the world finally slowed down enough for memory to speak louder than ambition. The interviews had stopped. The cameras were gone. The questions that once circled her like predators no longer mattered. And still, one name remained untouched by time. Dean Martin. The question she was never asked again. In her final years, Katharine was often praised for her independence. Writers framed her life as a triumph of willpower, a woman who needed no one, who bowed to no expectation, who stood alone by choice. They were wrong, but not in the way they thought. She had stood alone. She had chosen restraint, but not because she lacked connection, because she had known it once and understood its cost. No interviewer ever asked her the question that mattered most. Was there something you protected by staying silent? If they had, she might not have answered. But she would have paused, and that pause would have told the entire story. the man who never claimed credit. Dean Martin never spoke publicly about her. Not once. No anecdote. No nostalgic remark. No hint of significance. To the world, she was simply another peer, respected, distant, unrelated. But those closest to Dean noticed something unusual. He kept certain letters, old programs, a few clippings folded carefully, never displayed. Not trophies, reminders. He understood that the most meaningful roles he had played were not the ones audiences applauded. They were the ones no one would ever see. When death removes the risk, but not the duty. When Dean passed, the world mourned loudly. Tributes poured in, stories were told, memories reshaped him into something simpler than he had ever been. Katharine watched from a distance. People expected her to say something. She didn't, because death does not cancel responsibility. If anything, it seals it. She knew that revealing the truth now, when Dean could no longer choose silence, would be a betrayal, not a confession. So she kept the secret. Even then, the private moment that ended the story. Not long before her own passing, Katharine requested privacy for an afternoon. No assistants. No visitors. No press. She sat alone, surrounded by nothing but quiet and the accumulated weight of memory. And for the first time in decades, she allowed herself to speak his name out loud. Not in regret. In gratitude. She didn't dramatize it. Didn't romanticize it. She simply acknowledged what had always been true. That one act of quiet understanding had shaped how she measured character for the rest of her life. Not ambition. Not brilliance. Not success. But restraint. Why the secret was never meant to be told. Some stories lose their power the moment they are explained. This was one of them. It wasn't about romance. It wasn't about sacrifice. It wasn't even about two famous people crossing paths. It was about something Hollywood rarely celebrates. A moment where nothing was taken. Nothing was claimed. Nothing was owed. Only protected. And that protection, chosen again and again, year after year, became the real legacy. What the world missed. Audiences remember Katharine Hepburn as fearless. They remember Dean Martin as effortless. What they never saw was the space between those images, the place where true strength lived. The ability to walk away without bitterness. The discipline to remain silent when truth could serve ego. The grace to value another person's life above one's own need to be understood. That was the secret, and it survived because it was never spoken. The final truth. In the end, there was no reveal. No headline. No confession. No dramatic unveiling. Only a quiet understanding that some of the most powerful human connections exist entirely outside the record of history. And that kindness, real kindness, often asks for one thing in return. Nothing.